Greetings and welcome to Word Magazine. This is Jeff Riddle. I'm the pastor of Christ Reformed Baptist Church in Louisa, Virginia. And yes, I know it's been a while since I've done one of these Word Magazine podcasts. It's been a very busy, fulfilling month or so. And I was just busy with a lot of things. At the end of September, I was involved with the Keach Conference, which is the annual conference for the Reformed Baptist Fellowship of Virginia. We were hosting my friend and fellow Reformed Baptist pastor from Budapest, Hungary, and his wife. And then just after they left, my wife and I left to go to England, where I had the privilege of speaking at the 25th Salisbury Conference at the Emmanuel Church in Salisbury, England. Had a wonderful time there, met a lot of wonderful people. And then after that was completed, my wife and I went to Cornwall. We drove out there and had a little bit of a vacation. We were able to visit some of the beautiful places there in that far southwestern corner of England. Beautiful coastal towns. We were staying in Newquay, and we were staying at the pastor's house, and a 5-minute walk down the street, we were on Porth Beach, and we enjoyed some beautiful coastal walking on what they call the coastal path. And then we went to a little tourist town called St. Ives. Also went to another town north of where we were, a little fishing village called Port Isaac. We also got to see some of the Wesley sites, a lot of John Wesley sites in Cornwall. We drove to a little place called Gwinnett Pit, which is a collapsed mine. Makes a sort of an amphitheater where Wesley preached some 18 times. And then at the end of our stay, we drove up to Cardiff in Wales and got to see the castle, got to visit the Parliament, the Welsh Parliament, and then back to London and home. And the last couple of weeks since we've gotten back, it's just been catching up. But I thought I would do this Word Magazine, and it's going to be probably a pretty long Word Magazine, longer than I sometimes do with these podcasts. I did want to say that while I was in England, I was encouraged to meet several people who are regular and avid listeners to this podcast. And one of them in particular was exhorting me to put some more Word magazines out there. And I told him that when I got back, the first episode that I recorded, I was gonna dedicate to him. So I want to dedicate this podcast to my friend Terry, who is originally from County Tyrone, but is now living in Tiverton, England. And so, Terry, this episode is dedicated to you. What's the topic for this episode of Word Magazine? In this episode, I'm going to be offering a rejoinder to a podcast that appeared on the Mark Ward channel. Mark Ward, is it unfair if I describe Mark Ward at this point as a hypercritic of the King James Version? He posted, though, back, it was September the 26th of 2024. So this was just before the Keach conference. And again, I was hosting my friend, Pastor Miklos. I didn't have time or really interest to respond to it, but he posted this video that was it was an hour and a half video, and it was a 3-person panel. It was Mark Ward and also Dr. William Ross from RTS Seminary in Charlotte. Ross is an Old Testament professor there, and also Dr. John Meade, who's an Old Testament professor at Phoenix Seminary in Phoenix, Arizona. And they were critiquing or responding to or reviewing the Reformation Bible Society meeting that was held on August the 3rd of this year. And that meeting was dedicated to looking at the topic of the traditional text and the Septuagint. And so they were offering this critique, and I wanted to offer a response. And so today I'm going to be able to take the time to do that very thing, to try to offer a response, a rejoinder to their review or response to the Reformation Bible Society meeting. And it just so happens that that Mark Ward has sort of been on people's minds here lately, because he had a debate last week with a fellow who is a defender of use of the King James Version. And Mark Ward made some statements, including a statement that the King James Version should not be given to children, and it's even a sin to give this Bible to children. And so that his statements there have created some controversy. But in this episode, we're reviewing something that he said about a month ago, some things he said about a month ago, and this, again, this response review that he orchestrated and had Ross and Meade take part in. Let me just say what we're going to do with this episode. I'm gonna give some preliminary analysis, and then I want to go to the video of the review or response itself, and I want to see if we can walk through a little bit of it. Like I said, it's an hour and a half in length. I don't think we're going to get through all of it. We'll probably just scratch the surface today, and we may or may not have a future episode that will continue the review. But we'll just see what we can get started today, and lay some foundations for a rejoinder to some of the things that were said. Let me just begin by saying, on one hand, when I saw this review appear from Mark Ward and Ross and Meade, my first thought was that I was happy that they did this, because this is exactly what we wanted to happen with the Reformation Bible Society. We wanted to stir up interest, to add to the conversation about the contemporary use of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation or translations of the Old Testament that are being used in the contemporary era to correct the traditional or Masoretic Hebrew text. And so we are opposing that, and we wanted to create some conversation about it. And by virtue of the fact that these men did this review of our meeting, it, contributes to the interest in the topic and even the interest in the meeting. And so my hope is that there might be persons who would have watched that review, and maybe even this rejoinder, and who might be spurred on by this to go and look at and watch the lectures, the plenary lectures, and the breakout sessions that were offered at the Reformation Bible Society meeting. So on one hand, I was happy to see this review, and happy to see that it was creating some conversation. On the other hand, however, we do believe that there were some pretty serious misunderstandings and misrepresentations of the Reformation Bible Society in general, of this particular 2024 conference, and some of its various papers and speakers and lectures that were presented. And so I do want to address and attempt to give rejoinders to and correct, I think, some of the misunderstandings and misstatements that were put forward. These men were not neutral reviewers of our meeting. They have a perspective, and they didn't like the perspective that we were putting forward. In fact, they're promoting something that's very different than the position that we have from a traditional text or from a confessional text or Reformation text position. So I think the misunderstandings, again, were many, but I want to point to two key issues that I noticed right from the start with this video. And let me just see if I can pull up the video. Here we go. This is the video from Mark Ward's channel. And I want to start with the title of this response. Look at the title down here. KJV defenders turn against the Septuagint, a response to the Reformation Bible Society. So from the very beginning, there are some problems with just the way this whole response or review is posed. And perhaps Ross and Meade didn't know how Mark Ward was going to frame this discussion, but this is the way he framed it. KJV defenders turn against the Septuagint. Is that the best way? Is it an accurate way to represent what the Reformation Bible Society is about? That's the question. So the first problem is Mark Ward misrepresents the Reformation Bible Society through this title by giving the impression that this society is primarily devoted merely to the defense of the King James Version translation of the Bible into English. However, if you know anything about the Reformation Bible Society, you would know that that would be a misunderstanding, a misstatement about what the Reformation Bible Society is about. So let me see if I can pull up the website for the Reformation Bible Society, reformationbiblesociety.org. And you might notice as I pull this up, just last week we set the meeting date for the 2025 conference. It'll be Saturday, August the 2nd of 2025. And we also set the theme for next year's meeting, which will be the book of Revelation, the last book in the New Testament canon. And we're going to be looking at issues related to text and canonical issues related to the book of Revelation. We are right now doing the finalization of decisions on where the meeting is going to be held. Most likely it's not going to be held in Lynchburg. It's going to be held, as it was last year, it's going to be held in another region of the country, and hope that might enable some people who weren't able to maybe to attend last year's meeting might be able to attend this year's meeting or next year's meeting in 2025, because it might be in your area. But I don't want to talk about now. We'll have some specific announcements about details later. But I just want to look at the About page for the Reformation Bible Society. Remember, Mark Ward has presented this idea that our society is about defending the King James Version. King James Version defenders turn against the Septuagint. And so here's the About page. This has our Constitution. Here are the officers. I'm serving as the chairman. Jonathan Arnold, who's the pastor of Westminster Baptist Church in London, England, and also the general secretary for the Trinitarian Bible Society, is our treasurer. And Christian McShaffrey, who is a Presbyterian minister serving an OPC church in Reedsburg, Wisconsin, is our secretary. Now, here is the statement of the purpose for the Reformation Bible Society. The purpose of the society shall be to foster and promote scholarly study, defense, and interpretation of the traditional Reformation text of Christian scripture, i.e., the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Old Testament and received texts of the Greek New Testament, by providing a medium for the oral exchange and written expression of thought and research. So what is the purpose of the Reformation Bible Society? We are devoted to defense and interpretation of the traditional original text, the Hebrew Masoretic Old Testament, the Greek received text for the New Testament. And then Article 3 is the doctrinal basis, which is Chapter 1, Paragraph 8 of the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. And the stress there is upon the fact that the Old Testament in Hebrew and the New Testament in Greek were immediately inspired by God and by his singular care and providence, kept pure in all ages, so that they are authentical. So the stress is on the original Hebrew, the original Greek, immediately inspired, preserved by God. And it goes on in the second half of this doctrinal statement to talk about the importance of translations, because God's people have a right unto an interest in the scriptures. They are to be translated into the vulgar language of every nation. So, not just into English or French or Hungarian or German or Dutch, but into the language of every nation. So, there is a place in our society for discussion of translations. But I just want to point out that Mark Ward, through giving our meeting, describing it as relating to defenders of the King James Version, is from the very beginning misrepresenting what our society is about. And I don't know why Dr. Ross, who attended the conference and who heard the presentations, I don't know why he didn't correct uh, um, Ward. I don't know why John Meade, he's going on a program to critique the Reformation Bible Society. You would think that perhaps they might take the time to try to understand what the society is about, what our aims and purposes are. Secondly, look at this title. King James Version defenders turn against the Septuagint. So this is another area where there are some problems with the way this discussion is framed right from the beginning. This idea of the fact that we were turning against the Septuagint is strange on a couple levels. For one thing, given that this was the first ever Reformation Bible Society meeting in 2024, it could hardly represent a change in focus. We didn't meet the previous year or any other year. This was the first meeting ever. So there was no change in the Reformation Bible Society from what has been the focus from the time it was founded, which was this year. For another, this language of turning against the Septuagint is inaccurate in that within our conference, we were not against the Septuagint per se. Now, we were clearly against using the Septuagint to correct the Hebrew Masoretic text, because we believe that is the classic Protestant position, which really went unchallenged throughout this entire video. The classic Protestant position is that the standard text for the Old Testament is the Hebrew Masoretic text. And so, yes, we were saying that the Septuagint or any other translation, whether it be the Latin Vulgate or whether it be the Syriac or the Septuagint, should not be used to correct the Hebrew text. But if you listen to the presentations, for example, the one by Dr. Fuller, the very beginning, he spent some time talking about the value of the Septuagint, how that it helps understand vocabulary, syntax, and translation of the Old Testament. And so we're not against the Septuagint per se. We just do not believe it should be used to correct the Hebrew original. Perhaps what Ward meant by this, and I think he does say something about this in the response, is he claims that we were doing something different because we were not talking in this conference explicitly about the New Testament, but this is primarily an issue related to the Old Testament. The Septuagint, of course, is a translation of the Old Testament scriptures into Greek. And I just want to say that this is also or reflects cloudy thinking on Ward's part about what the confessional text or the Reformation text or the classic Protestant traditional text is about. And I would go all the way back 2 years ago. Christian McShaffrey and I co-edited this book, Why I Preach from the Received Text. It's an anthology of 25 essays written by officers in Reformed churches, 24 pastors, Presbyterians, Baptists primarily, and one deacon. And the editorial introduction to this book is co-written by myself and by Christian McShaffrey. And we tried to make plain in the introduction to this book what we were interested in. And of course, Christian and I are both involved in the Reformation Bible Society as well. And Jonathan Arnold contributed an article, and a number of people who attended and gave papers at this conference were also people who contributed to this book. But on page 15 in this editorial introduction, we made the point that our interest is in retrieving the classic Protestant bibliology. We want to retrieve the bibliology of the Reformers and also the post-Reformation divines, sometimes called the Protestant Orthodox. And we noted on page 15 that these godly men affirmed, quote, the classic Protestant printed editions of the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Old Testament and the Textus Receptus of the Greek New Testament as the standard text of the Christian Bible. This traditional or received text provided a fateful touchstone for Protestant Bible-believing scholars, ministers, churchmen, and congregations as they conducted their ministries. This text was the basis for scholarly study, preaching, and translation of the Bible amongst the Protestant churches. So this is not a new idea. We're not turning anywhere. This has been the idea that we have long held. We are looking for a whole Bible, a whole canon bibliology. And I might also just point out, Mark Ward famously rushed to do a very quick negative review, really fought against our book, tried to poison the well against our book, tried to say that we were KJV-onlyist and so forth, as he's continued to do. But on page 17 of the editorial introduction to this book, we noted the following, quote, critics of the traditional text, in fact, often confuse our position, whether intentionally or unintentionally, with King James Version onlyism, a position which is inconsistent with Westminster Confession of Faith and London Baptist Confession of Faith, chapter 1 and paragraph 8, end quote. And so we just point out what should be a basic understanding of anyone who looks at this issue. We're not promoting any form of translation onlyism. That is incompatible if you're confessional. If you hold to chapter 1, paragraph 8, you believe in the immediate inspiration of the original Hebrew and Greek. And we'll talk about this later because I don't think that any of the three of the men on the panel really understand a principle that Christian McShaffrey talked about in his lecture, that of what is called the double divine authority of Scripture, that the originals in Hebrew and Greek have a double divine authority. They have an authority of matter or content and also of form, the words, whereas translations have an authority on matter or content as they agree with what was written in the immediately inspired divine originals, but they do not have a formal authority, that is, by means of the words, because the Bible is written in Hebrew and Greek, not in English or in French or Spanish or Greek, or the Old Testament wasn't written in Greek. It wasn't written in Latin. So that's just a fundamental difference. And so anyone who is confessional cannot be any translation onlyism. It's impossible. It's a logical non sequitur, and it's irrational for Mark Ward to continue to promote these types of ideas. He's been corrected, but he has not listened. And sadly, it sounds like Ross and Meade and others just seem to follow along with, I think, without giving serious reflection to these issues. So here are the questions I think that one needs to ask from the beginning. We're going to get to the review, but just the way that this is framed in the title of this response, one needs to ask these questions. Why did Mark Ward feel compelled intentionally to misrepresent the stated purpose of the Reformation Bible Society and of our 2024 conference? Why did Dr. Ross and Dr. Meade follow Ward's lead and not attempt to correct him in his error? Could it be that they felt more comfortable attacking a straw man of the Reformation Bible Society rather than the position that we actually hold, rather than attempting to understand and respond to? Because it really is a fascinating topic. It's a really fascinating subject. We're saying there was a classic Protestant view, and we're saying that in the modern era, in the 21st century, that 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 classic view, the Protestant view of text, has been disregarded for something new and something that is out of joint with the classic Protestant view, which holds for the Old Testament the Hebrew Masoretic text as the standard. It purports that text has been kept pure in all ages, and it is not corrupted, and therefore does not need the Latin Vulgate or the Greek Septuagint or the Syriac or the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Samaritan Pentateuch to correct the text, but the traditional text needs to be upheld. I'm thankful that there were at least, I think, many people when they heard or saw this video. Of course, unfortunately, some people just without any discernment, accept Ward's false framing, false misrepresentation for his false presentation, misrepresentation of the Reformation Bible Society. But there were some people who saw through this. I noticed that one person on Mark Ward's YouTube site where the video was posted, he offered this comment. He wrote, quote, KJV defenders, question mark. You mean defenders of the traditional text? And then he said, you're gaslighting in the title before you ever even make any arguments. And that person was very discerning, and what he said is absolutely true. This title, the way that Mark Ward framed this, unfortunately, it's kind of par for the course for the way in which he has approached our position, and it's gaslighting. It's simply misrepresenting our position. There was in this response, there was a lot of really sort of harsh criticism of many of the presentations at the Reformation Bible Society. A lot of real condescension, and there were a lot of attacks on what I would call the intellectual virtues of the conference and the presenters. We were accused in this review of being sloppy, of sleight of hand, of being misleading, being deceptive, being fallacious. And it was sad to see such condescension and misunderstanding, especially the ironic thing is that the video begins with falsely framing what our conference was about. So I'm not sure any of these three fellows ever really understood what our conference was about. And and again, the irony is, I don't think that they demonstrated a lot of intellectual virtue in the way they approached understanding our conference and responding to it. I know this is getting to be a long intro, but these are some important things to consider. I want to go back to Ward's video, and I want to point out something else was interesting about it, and that is um, Mark Ward, alongside of the video, uh, posted a blog article. And again, I'm not really even sure that Ross and Meade knew about this article, but he posted an article simultaneously on September the 26th of 2024 that was titled "Breaking My 2-Year Asterisk." Breaking my 2-year silence asterisk on confessional bibliology. And you can see that the article title is superimposed over uh, a thumbnail for a video that Mark Ward did 2 years ago, September the 1st of 2022, that was titled "My Public Discussion with Confessional Bibliology Sufficeth Me." And so 2 years ago, Mark Ward made this dramatic public pledge that he was no longer going to interact with people who hold to the position that I and Jonathan Arnold and Christian McShaffrey and the other persons who are members of the Reformation Bible Society, he was no longer going to interact with us. And he claims that he had been silent about this for the last 2 years. It's really interesting if you go back and watch this video from that he did, "My Public Discussion with Confessional Bibliology Sufficeth Me," because it's also very, I don't know, self-justifying. It's quite harsh. He gets to the end of that video and he says he declares from the beginning we are not polite company. Basically accuses us of being uncharitable toward him. Although honestly, the amount of interaction we had with him has been fairly minimal, aside from the times when he has publicly attacked our position. I did do one lecture at a Kept Pure conference where I did a review of his Detroit Baptist Theological Journal article attacking the traditional text position and pointing out some of the basic factual errors that were within it. But at the very end of that video, he says this. You can go back and listen to the last 30 seconds of it. He says that people in my camp, so he's talking about me, Jonathan Arnold, Christian McShaffrey, all the other people who are involved with the Reformation Bible Society, hold to the traditional text position. The 25 authors who contributed to the book Why I Preach from the Received Text. He said, quote, that we are neither confessional nor, more importantly, biblical. That's the end of the quote. He accuses us 2 years ago, you're not confessional. Now that's kind of ironic because I don't know what confession Mark Ward holds to. Apparently, he doesn't hold to the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. He doesn't hold the Westminster Confession of Faith, but he claims the authority to declare that I, who am a Reformed Baptist pastor and hold to the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, and who belongs to a church that fully subscribes to the confession, that I am not confessional. And not only that, I'm not biblical. I am in an unbiblical position. It's sort of like when he declared last week that anyone who would give a King James version to a child is committing a sin. And I think probably if you were you wouldn't have to press him very far. He would say that Reformation Bible Society is promoting sin. That would be my guess. So, anyways, he has this intriguing blog article, and if you haven't read it, I would encourage you to read it. I'm gonna be honest with you, and I'm going to say it's peculiar in many ways. It's filled with personal pejoratives. It attacks the confessional bibliology position. It does something that Marquardt also claimed he wouldn't do. He tries to conflate our position with his definition of IFB King James Version onlyism. One of the things challenges I've posed him is define your terms, because basically anyone who uses the King James Version, he classifies as a King James Version onlyist, or he puts everyone in the category of a KJV defender. Think about the title of the video. Um, he says some harsh things in this article. He says that those of us who uphold the traditional text have uttered, quote, truly bizarre and extreme things. He claims that my friend Christian McShaffrey's little booklet that's published by the Trinitarian Bible Society, How the Holy Bible Came to Be, contains what Marquardt calls, quote, Gale Ripplinger level arguments, end quote. And he suggests at the very end of the article that the handful of responses that I have given to his critique of the confessional text position, he describes them as, quote, weak and confused, end quote. And he says he's embarrassed by my arguments and they don't even warrant a response. They're so intellectually embarrassing. But it didn't stop him from doing this video or posting this. Best way to describe this blog article is as a screed. As I said, it's interesting. Somewhere in here, uh, he uh, he notes that, yes, here it is. He says, I did publicly commit to Jeff Riddle that I would not call confessional bibliology KJV onlyism. Um, and um, he goes back and he vacillates. He says things that are contradictory. He says there are key differences between, again, undefined IFB King James Version onlyism and confessional bibliology. And he talks about differences of style and substance. But when you get to the end of the article, he says, where is it? Let me find it. Oh, he says, confessional bibliology and mainstream IFB King James Version onlyism are as similar as two TR editions. Trying to be funny. He knows that one of our points is there aren't significant differences between the mature printed editions of the TR. And so basically he's saying confessional bibliology and what he calls IFB KJV onlyism, it's basically the same thing. But anyways, so within this article, he violates this pledge that he made, this public commitment. What's he talking about there? Well, he's talking about, let's see if I can find it. Yeah, it was back in July of 2022. I did respond on my blog to a couple of his acerbic comments about confessional bibliology. And I might come back to this blog post actually, because one of my critiques of him is he wants to evaluate translations without any reference to the text from which the translations are made. I asked him a series of questions about what his views on the text were, which he's never answered. And he made a comment on this, and the comment was this: Dr. Riddle, I had 2 long talks with Dane Johansen this week, phone and text, and I got private messages from Dwayne Green and Robert Vaughn. I also talked to Tim Berg, all kindly and clearly said the same thing. I should stop calling confessional bibliology King James Version onlyism. I have prayerfully considered their appeal and yours, and I have decided to stop using that label for both you and for those mainstream IFB KJV TR defenders such as Joe Shakur, etc. So he publicly committed 2 years ago he was going to stop conflating our position with King James Version onlyism, and he was going to stop any public interaction with our position. And now, obviously, he has backtracked that. And so, therefore, I think it's especially appropriate that we give some response. We haven't offered much response to anything that he's put out the last couple of years. He's told us we're not confessional, we're not biblical, and his interactions with us sufficeth him. And he claims even with this article that he's breaking supposedly a 2-year silence. But friends, I want to ask anybody who's fair-minded, go back and look at the archive for Mark Ward's YouTube channel over the last 2 years. And did he stop his public discussion with the confessional text view, the Reformation text view? I mean, he did his second round of the so-called Textual Confidence Collective, talking about Westcott and Hort, and all throughout that, there were many challenges to those of us who hold to the traditional text. I think about 7 or 8 months ago, he did an interview with Maurice Robinson, who is a defender of Byzantine priority. And the whole conversation was not about the King James Version. It was about the Byzantine text versus the TR. And the title he gave to that presentation was Maurice Robinson versus King James Version Onlyism. And then more recently, I think within the last month, he had an episode on his channel that was titled, Will New Testament Textual Criticism Ever Stop? And this was a direct response to, he mentioned Peter Van Cleek Jr. by name, Peter Van Cleek Jr.'s challenge to James White in a debate. Can you give me a single text in the New Testament that will not be changed by modern discoveries or by changes in the modern critical text method? And Van Cleek used that argument, but I also had used that same argument in my online debate with James White. Obviously, this was a public discussion about the traditional text view over against the modern critical text. So I don't know what to say about Mark Ward claiming that he stopped interacting with our position 2 years ago, or claiming that he has stopped publicly falsely conflating the traditional text view with some undefined or ill-defined definition of King James Version onlyism. But clearly, he has continued this interaction, and he's continued to put forward these unjust conflations. One more thing before we move on to the video itself. I thought it was very interesting at the end of this blog post, and I would encourage you, like I said, to read it for yourself. There were some comments that were left, and there were two comments in particular that stood out to me, and both of them came from persons whom I don't know, and who I think were quite actually friendly to Ward's position. The first one is this fellow named Dave McPherson. I don't know him, but this was the comment he posted. He said, let me see here. He said, I will try to listen to your audio version of your article. If I might offer a bit of constructive criticism, no malice within. You remind me of the fellow who said, if 20 words will explain my idea, why not use 100 words to make me understood better? May I suggest you try to trim back a little of your perspective? I have always felt economy of words serves one best. Further, as I do not know you well, I would say there is a possibility that this KJV only issue has become an obsession with you. Um, you appear to be well read and perhaps have larger ministry labors aside from the KJV only matter. I hope so. But just pointing out, I think from the tone of this article, it seems like maybe this has become an obsession for you. Unfortunately, I don't think, given the Mark Ward's response here, pray for me, brother, the obsession ends on December 31, 2024. I don't think he probably took to heart what Dave McPherson was saying. And by the way, Mark Ward is now saying at the end of 2024, he's going to stop all interactions related to the King James Version. I hate to be a pessimist, but I have a feeling that this pledge is going to end up about like the one he made 2 years ago to stop interacting with our position, and the pledge he made to stop conflating our position with King James Version onlyism undefined. There was a second comment, again, by someone who's friendly to his cause, that I thought was intriguing. He said, this person was Alex Kraus. He said, "You've invested a lot and can't let it go," is how your post sounds. It's almost like a psychological addiction that is very common in the business world, the sunk cost fallacy. To move on, you will have to forget your previous investment. The words of Jesus seem appropriate. Leave them alone. If the blind lead the blind, will they not both fall into the ditch? And again, I think this person is making a very interesting observation. He's doing it quite charitably, but basically saying, Mark, I read through this article, listen to the tone of it, and it sounds almost like you have a psychological addiction. Well, how did Mark Wood respond? He said, "Oh, I love these people. I really do." Um, I'm not sure he took seriously what seems to me is a pretty discerning critique that was posed. Well, with that now, let's go ahead and move on to the video itself. And thank you for being patient with me in that longer introduction, because we do need to set the stage. And like I said, just the title for this thing, the assumptions that were inherent from the very beginning, set us up for a response to our conference that is going to be filled with misunderstandings, because it's framed with misunderstandings from the very beginning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be playing the video, and I'm going to stop and start, and I may look at some other things as we go. And like I said, we're not going to get through all of it today. I don't have the time for it. It's an hour and a half in length, but I hope maybe we can get a good chunk of the beginning of it reviewed. So let's start off with Mark Ward's opening statements about this response, the KJV version defenders turning against the Septuagint.
Almost exactly 2 years ago, I made a video on this channel explaining why I was no longer willing to engage publicly with proponents of confessional bibliology.
Although you continued to do that over the last 2 years.
A form of King James Version defense with which I'd come to multiple frustrating impasses. I've held my tongue for 2 years as they've continued to promote a viewpoint that I consider to be identical to the King James onlyism of my youth.
They continue to present a position that I consider to be identical to the King James Version onlyism of my youth. Does that sound to you like Mark Ward is keeping his pledge to stop conflating our position with an undefined or ill-defined version of King James Version onlyism? And the intriguing thing is he's not even aware of how he makes these pledges and then violates them. And he also, again, with all of this conversation, he's an intelligent man, and all the responses we've given to him, he still doesn't understand the difference between a confessional view of defending the traditional text and holding to the autoritas divina duplex, the double divine authority of Scripture, that upholds the immediate inspiration of the originals and faithful translations versus Gail Ripplinger or Peter Ruckman, or even our friends who are non-confessional, who are independent fundamental Baptists who prefer the King James Version. He doesn't understand that we can't be KJV only, and that this is a misrepresentation of our position. We have directly told him, read Richard Muller's entry in his Dictionary of Theological Terms on the Autoritas Divina Duplex. And he doesn't seem to have read that. He doesn't seem to have heard us, and he continues to conflate our position with something that it is not.
Except that they also appeal to the Westminster Confession and the Protestant scholastics.
They say that the only difference between us and an IFB fundamentalist is we appeal to the Westminster Confession and we appeal to the Protestant Orthodox. But he doesn't understand, it's not just that we appeal to the confession, it's that we hold to what the confession teaches about Scripture. We are attempting to hold the same position that the Protestant Orthodox held. And it's not just that we appeal to them or we cite them, it's that we hold the positions that they hold.
Appeals that the anti-Calvinist, independent, fundamental Baptist, King James onlyists whose church I attended in high school did not make when I lived among them as a teenager. However, they do it now. I have heard IFB leaders pick up the kept pure in all ages line, as I presume, from Confessional Bibliology leader Dr. Jeff Riddle. I even predicted this would happen. The most responsible and influential proponents of both viewpoints now act and speak almost identically. One just has a Southern twang, the other a...
We act and speak almost identically. Does he not understand the difference between a confessional perspective on defense of the traditional text, despite the fact that we have interpreted and explained it so many times?
Reformed one. Today, I would say that the main remaining substantive difference between mainstream, the text is the issue, King James onlyism, and confessional bibliology is the educational level attained by the latter. Confessional...
Strange. The only difference is that we have people who have doctoral degrees and master of divinity degrees from mainstream Reformed or evangelical seminaries. That's the only difference. You can't look at the substance of the differences.
Bibliologists can do something that IFB King James defenders don't do. They can put on academic conferences to promote the King James Version. And they did just this in early August.
Academic conferences to promote the King James Version. Again, please go back and read the statement of purpose for the Reformation Bible Society. I don't think there's a mention of the King James Version in the entire Constitution. What Mark Ward is doing is gaslighting. He's misrepresenting our conference. It's perfectly legitimate, I think, to defend and to have discussions about translations, English translations, French translations, Hungarian translations. It's perfectly legitimate to have even organizations devoted to translations of the Bible or defending good translations versus bad translations. But he's missing what the Reformation Bible Society is about. This is particularly discouraging because along with the plenary lectures and the short papers that were given, I also gave about an 8-9 minute talk that was an introduction to the Reformation Bible Society at the conference, and it's there. You can find it on the Word Magazine channel. You can find it on the Kept Pure in All Ages conference channel. And I have my notes for it right here. I started off by saying, as we call this meeting to order, let us state that the purpose of this society is to foster and promote scholarly study, defense, and interpretation of the traditional Reformation texts of Christian scripture, the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Old Testament, and the received texts of the Greek New Testament. I noted that our doctrinal statement was the Westminster Confession of Faith, Second London Confession of Faith, Chapter 1, Paragraph 8. And I went on to talk about why we were looking at the Septuagint. I pointed out that our meeting was not simply interested in a narrow atomistic specialization in Septuagintal studies, excuse me, but we were interested in the Reformation text and the Septuagint. And I noted that we were more interested in Reformation bibliology and defense of the traditional text. And we were in particular challenging those who were suggesting that the traditional text was corrupted and needed to be corrected by ancient versions. But I don't know, did he understand that? Does he understand it and he's intentionally misrepresenting us? I don't know, but it's still frustrating when this sort of thing happens, and it happens over and over again.
In Lynchburg, Virginia. The Reformation Bible Society conference alone would not suffice to bring me out of my self-imposed silence, but leading proponents of confessional bibliology have taken another step that the IFB King James defenders have not. They've taken the debate over the King James from the New Testament to the Old.
Again, misrepresentation of our position. 2 years ago, in Why I Preach from the Received Text, we said our interest is in the whole Bible, the whole canon. Our interest is in the Masoretic text of the Old Testament, the Greek received text of the New Testament. We have always been interested in the whole Bible. We did not make this decision to talk about the Septuagint because we were trying to distinguish ourselves from IFB fundamentalism. That wasn't on our radar screen at all. We were doing that because this is consistent with what our society is about. This is consistent with what the whole movement towards retrieval of the classic Protestant position is about. And what Mark Ward is doing here is profoundly misrepresenting our movement.
In particular, the overriding theme of their recent conference was an insistence that the Hebrew Masoretic text has been kept pure in all ages, like the New Testament, and
which is the classic Protestant position.
And that therefore modern English and other Bible translations are wrong to use Septuagint readings. If you don't know what I meant by what I just said,
wrong to use readings to correct the Hebrew.
I've got experts here to help us all understand. I've got two of them. Will Ross is a recognized expert on what is generally called the Septuagint. We'll explain why I gave it that hedging title. He's Associate Professor of Old Testament and Director of the Doctor of Ministry program at Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. He is the author of The Septuagint, What It Is and Why It Matters, a book that I myself have read and enjoyed. I also have with me today, via the magic of the internet, John Meade, Professor of Old Testament, co-director of the Text and Canon Institute, which means a lot to me personally, a friend and colleague of Peter Gurry, and author with Gurry of Scribes in Scripture, The Amazing Story of How We Got the Bible. Will is an expert on the Septuagint. John is an expert on Old Testament textual criticism. These are the ideal guests to help me evaluate the inaugural Reformation Bible Society conference focused on the Septuagint. So, Will, before we get into the details, you actually attended the Reformation Bible Society conference. Why did you go? How many people were present? What were your overall impressions?
Yeah, well, first, Mark, just let me say thanks for hosting me. It's great to be here with John. I'm glad we have some time to do this, and I think it is important, which is why I wanted to do it. So glad to be here. I went to the conference. It was a good experience. 2 years ago, I had never heard.
Let me just pause here for a moment. We'll listen to him. I'm glad to hear him say he came to the conference. He was welcome to come. The conference was open for anyone who was interested, as long as they were willing to participate in a charitable and orderly manner. And I think he was kind of surprised. I don't know if he thought that we were going to attack him the moment he walked through the door, but I'm glad to hear him say that he had a good experience overall. He was certainly warmly welcomed and treated charitably. And so I'm glad that he was willing to acknowledge that.
Heard of Confessional Bibliology, but I was contacted by email in January of 23 by Jeff Riddle, who's one of the proponents of Confessional Bibliology, and he was in the process of reviewing my book on the Septuagint with Greg Lanier. who's a
I guess it was January 2023. I sent an email to Dr. Ross and to Greg Lanier, who teaches New Testament at RTS in Orlando, and they co-teach a class in the RTS system, Reformed Theological Seminary system, on the Septuagint. And I had written a review of their book, The Septuagint, What It Is and Why It Matters, published by Crossway. And my review appeared in the Puritan Reformed Journal. I had some positive things to say about the book, but towards the end of the book, I had some negative things to say about it because at the close of the book, throughout the book, they suggest that the Hebrew text is corrupted in places and that the Septuagint and other ancient evidences can be used at places to correct the Hebrew Bible. And I pointed out in my review that this modern perspective is actually a departure from the classic Protestant perspective of men like Francis Turretin and John Owen. And so Lanier I never heard back from, but Ross and I had a bit of an email exchange. And it was interesting. He says that he had never heard of confessional bibliology before 2 years ago. Now, he may not have heard of the contemporary attempt to retrieve the classic Protestant position, but honestly, I think in many ways he was unaware of the classic Protestant position, despite the fact that he's a professor in a Reformed Theological Seminary, directing doctoral ministry, those pursuing a doctoral of ministry degree, teaching MDiv students, I guess, and others. I don't think they have a PhD program, so he's not advising doctoral candidates. But this is the interesting thing with the atomization of theological studies in the academy. Persons may specialize in something quite narrow, like the Septuagint, and they might not know much about historical theology or systematic theology. And it's one of the dangers, really, of what's happening today. So, anyways, now he may counter and say, "Well, your position, I don't think accurately represents the classic Protestant position." But that's the question that's the discussion that should be taking place in this review, which sadly doesn't take place. But anyways, yes, so we had this interaction, and I try to do that. I've tried to do that in recent years. If I write a review of someone's book, I often try to send them a copy of my reviews, just so they're aware of the fact that I have reviewed it.
colleague at RTS Orlando. And the email was amicable, but it kicked off a long and ultimately rather pointless exchange in which I responded to his criticisms and on it went.
And Ross say this, or and Ward say this, and I think this is interesting because their perspective seems to be, I tried to correct Riddle, and it was just pointless because every time I corrected him, he would have a response back to me, and basically he wouldn't agree with me. And isn't that the point though of an exchange? We don't have the same view. We do disagree. But am I in the wrong because I don't say, "Oh, Dr. Ross, you're right. We should use the Septuagint to correct the Hebrew Bible." Is that the only way we can have a conversation? Is if one side capitulates and embraces the other view, if it's not convictionally what they hold to? I mean, I would like to win Dr. Ross over to my side, quite frankly. But not unless that's his conviction. But somehow, if I don't agree with him, I'm just leading him into a pointless, fruitless conversation. I was trying to convince him, and I wasn't agreeing with him, and I was giving counter evidence. And honestly, a lot of it he didn't seem to be aware of. Like I was telling him what Turretin really said, what John Owen really said. And I'm not sure he had a clear grasp on what the classic Protestant view on the Septuagint was. And I think after our conversations, after attending the conference, he actually has a much better view, but I'm not sure he would concede that. But anyway, let's listen to some more of what he has to say.
we came back to those criticisms, or we can come back to those criticisms later. But I learned about the Confessional Bibliology Conference last spring through a friend of mine, through Twitter. And in some of my reactions or in interactions to Riddle online, John's been part of some of these on Twitter. He made it clear that I would be welcome to attend. He even suggested that
This is funny because I think they thought, again, I think that maybe this comes from the conflation of our position with some undefined KJV onlyism. I think they had the thought that we would say to them, "You cannot come. We're going to bar the doors. We will not let, you uncircumcised Philistines come into our meeting." Of course, when he asked if he could attend the conference, we said, "Sure, yes, you can come. The conference is open to anyone who's willing to come in good faith and in an orderly manner and participate." And so, yes, we welcomed him to come. We wanted people like him to come. And so anyways, we were happy he was there.
I could submit a proposal, but of course, to submit a proposal, you have to agree with the premise on what they call the confessional text or the Reformation text. And so, since I don't agree with that premise, there was really no point in me submitting a proposal. But it's only about.
This is, I think, interesting too. He seems to think it's somehow strange or that we were being exclusive because we didn't invite him to present a paper, though he's a Septuagintal expert. And yes, we had a call for papers. And to join the Reformation Bible Society, you have to agree with the purpose of the society. You have to agree with the doctrinal basis. That's nothing strange. If you're a member of the Evangelical Theological Society, or ETS, which is a scholarly organization for evangelical scholars, they have a theological standard. You have to agree with inerrancy of Scripture, and you have to affirm the Trinity. And so if someone was a mainline Protestant who didn't believe in the doctrine of inerrancy, then they could not join the society, and they would not have the privileges of offering a paper for consideration. Or if someone was a Unitarian, didn't believe in the Trinity, they couldn't complain, "Oh, the ETS is being unfair to me because they won't let me present a paper." And it just so happens we have a very clear theological boundary for the Reformation Bible Society. We're not like maybe the Society of Biblical Literature, which is secular, which has people of all confessional or non-confessional, atheists, agnostics, universalists, and evangelicals. It's not a free-for-all for anybody. Yes, we have a doctrinal standard because we are committed to the basic principles of the Reformation Bible Society. You can come and listen, fine, but we're not going to necessarily invite you to teach. And again, our purpose is not some atomistic interest in the Septuagint. Our purpose is the Reformation text and the Septuagint. And if you don't hold to our common theological views, then you would not be an appropriate speaker for our conference.
2 hours from here to where the conference was in Virginia, right at Liberty University there. And so I hesitated, I vacillated, I thought, I don't know if it's worth driving up there, but ultimately I decided, mostly out of curiosity. I wasn't a plant for this interview. I just thought it'd be.
I wasn't a plant for this interview, but here he is sitting. He attended the conference, and now he's offering a critique of it.
Be interesting to hear the full case, specifically about the Septuagint, and see how it all played out. I wanted to get a sense for the people who would show up, kind of what the vibe was as well. And I would say there were maybe 50 people there, give or take.
There were actually about 67 people who were at the conference, and we were very pleased with the turnout. I think those 67 people came from about a dozen states. We had people who came from South Dakota and Illinois and Indiana and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and of course Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina. I think there was somebody from Florida there. So we had, 67 people. We had many pastors who were there. We had a good number of men who teach in seminary or Bible colleges who were there. So we felt very good about the meeting. We had students there. We had young men who are studying for the ministry there. We had older men, retired ministers who were there. So yes, we felt very good about that number for our first meeting.
Which is not a bad number. I've hosted conferences before, and that's a respectable number actually for a small conference. And yeah, overall, people were welcoming, friendly. The one exception to that was the guy I sat with at lunch, who found time to trash my church and my pastor before I let him know that I actually went to that church and that was my pastor and that he was speaking out of ignorance. So other than that,
I wasn't there. I didn't sit at the same table as Dr. Ross. So I didn't observe this conversation. If that person had that conversation and was rude or uncharitable, then he was certainly right to disagree with him. But probably not surprising if you go to a conference where there are people who hold conservative theological views, and maybe you're at a PCA church. There might be someone there who's going to be a little to the right of you and maybe has a critique of the PCA church, and maybe doesn't like sort of the Tim Keller wing of the PCA church. And I don't even know what church officially that Ross is part of, but anyways, I don't think that conversation made him so uncomfortable that he wanted to leave. He stayed for the entire conference, and he said already that his general experience was wholly positive.
it was a fascinating day and generally a positive day overall on a personal level. Yeah, it's fascinating. They did a lot of things well. It was well organized, well timed, welcoming. I spoke with Jeff Riddle early on. I, went up and said hello. He was nothing but friendly towards me, and I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that, Will.
Well, of course I was. You think I'm going to be intentionally unkind and uncharitable? Someone who attends a Reformation Bible Society meeting, who comes willing to participate in an orderly manner, even if he doesn't agree with our position. Of course, we're glad he's there. That's in part what we want. We wanted people who are unaware of the views of our conference to come and listen and hear us out and give us a fair listening. We're going to see later on. I'm not sure that we get a fair review here at all points, but I'm glad that Ross doesn't demonize us and says that we were charitable in welcoming him, and I'm thankful that he was able to give that positive report.
And you talked about their basic case, and let me turn to you, John. I know you've listened to some or maybe all. I listened to all of the publicly released addresses. I presume that was all the addresses and breakout sessions. How would you, John, represent and then evaluate the basic argument that they were making at the conference, especially when it came to what I felt was the central talk, that talk given by Jeff Riddle?
I'm not sure that my talk was the central talk. They claimed that. There were 4 plenary lectures. I'm not sure they really ever in this review gave a good outline of what happened in the conference. And they really talked mainly about my plenary lecture, a few of the short papers, and Christian McShaffrey's plenary lecture. But anyway, there were 4 plenary lectures. It was an interdisciplinary conference. Dr. Russell Fuller, formerly at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, gave the opening talk. That was kind of an Old Testament perspective where he basically laid the foundation. Some might say his talk was the primary one because he laid the foundation. Then I came along and I have a PhD in the New Testament and teach New Testament. I gave a kind of a New Testament perspective on understanding the Septuagint as a source, how it was quoted in the New Testament, evaluating the quotations from the Old Testament in the New Testament. That was my task. Then Dr. David Cranendonk from Puritan Seminary gave a historical theological perspective on the Septuagint, looking at how it was received and understood in the Reformation, the post-Reformation era, and he talked mainly about the continental evaluation of the Septuagint. He has a Dutch Reformed background himself, and so he's an interest in the continental Reformation. And then finally, Christian McShaffrey gave an apologetic theological analysis of the Septuagint, arguing obviously for the defense of the traditional text over against using the Septuagint to correct the Masoretic Hebrew text. So I'm not sure I would call my talk the central one. They claim it was that, but mine was just one of four 45-minute plenary lectures, and then there were a number of 25-minute short papers that were presented. By the way, we will be putting out eventually a print version of the papers. It will be called the Reformation Bible Society Seminar Papers. And it would have been nice, perhaps, if they might have waited till that came out, so that they could, fully understand our position better. But they wanted to come out with this review just of the oral presentations, the oral discussion that took place. But we will be coming out with a print version, which I think will address some of the misunderstandings that are presented in this review.
Yeah, I think I've listened to all of them now, at least.
By the way, just let me say, John Meade. Now, I'd never met Will Ross. We had communicated by emails back on August the 3rd at the conference. First time I met him in person. Now, Meade, I met several years back in Houston, Texas, because we were both delivering papers at the Houston Baptist University Theology Conference. And we met there, and we really had some very cordial interactions. In fact, we met there. We were both there doing papers in back-to-back years. One year it was about Erasmus. That was in 2016. And then one year it was about issues related to canon. And in some ways, Dr. Meade and I had some conversations where we were on the same page in criticizing some of the plenary speakers at the conference the second year who were I guess advocating for a wider view of canon than the traditional Christian view, Protestant view of canon. But anyways, he and I have had some cordial interactions. I was in some ways surprised at just how defensive and how uncharitable he was in some of his critiques of our conference. He wasn't there. And also, just pay attention to this. I think his affect during this whole critique is kind of interesting. He does a lot of laughing, a lot of big smiling. Sometimes people do that when they're nervous or they're unsure. And I think throughout this, I got the sense that he felt a little unsure or nervous about some of the criticisms that he was making.
The ones that are posted. I feel like there's a breakout or two maybe that was advertised that maybe is not out, but I could be misremembering. Yeah, I think Jeff Riddle's talk was probably the one that set the tone, at least from what I could see. It's this, in general, right? He's asking, how did the early church use the Septuagint? And he's really clear that he doesn't mean any early church other than the earliest church in the first century, right? Basically, he means the apostles, okay? How did the apostles relate to the Septuagint? He had 4 major claims. I don't know if I should go through all of them, but just kind of a general theme through these claims. His use of scholarship was really interesting.
Pause there. His use of scholarship was really interesting. One of the things that Dr. Meade seemed nonplussed by was maybe what we could call my theological method. And I'm not sure if he understood my pre-critical approach or the whole, again, there was a basic misunderstanding for all three of these, I think, of understanding what the Reformation text position is, what it is we're trying to retrieve. And so he can't get his mind around, it seems like, the fact that I made reference to mainstream scholarly discussions and writings, and I presented them, and I made reference to them. If I cited them, I cited them specifically. Took pains not to misrepresent them, but I took the information and used it actually to demonstrate how the modern view is in contradiction to the classic Protestant view. And it's almost as though Dr. Meade couldn't understand why I don't agree with the modern view. How can I cite these modern scholars and yet not agree with the modern view? So his brief summary of it is his use of scholarship was really interesting.
So, like, let me just give an example. Like, for the first claim, he says, this is a direct quote from his, PowerPoint slide. There was actually no standard or uniform so-called Septuagint at the time of the apostles. The Septuagint could not have been the Bible of the early church because there was no standard or uniform Septuagint at the time of the apostles. Okay. And fair enough.
Let's pause right there. Okay. So he said, I had 4 points I made. And the first point was there was no standard so-called Septuagint at the time of the apostles. There was no uniform one standard edition of the so-called Septuagint. No, there was no standard edition of the Greek Old Testament at the time that the apostles, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, wrote the New Testament. And notice he concedes that. Fair enough. He doesn't disagree with it. He's not saying that my point one is wrong. He just doesn't like the idea that I took that, which is a scholarly consensus today, and used it to demonstrate how, if there was no standard Septuagint at the time of the apostles, then we cannot claim that Paul was quoting the Septuagint or Matthew was quoting the Septuagint, etc. So he didn't like the way I marshaled the evidence to critique the modern position and uphold the classic Protestant position. And he's going to go on and talk in particular about how he didn't like the way I used the material presented by Peter J. Williams. So I'll let him continue.
Will's done a great job of problematizing this word Septuagint, and we can maybe get into some details here, but he brought in, our friend Peter Williams, right, who several years ago gave a talk. Actually, it was at a Arizona TGC event that I put on, actually, with Phoenix Seminary.
Interesting.
And we had Pete come in, and Pete gave a talk on why I don't believe in the Septuagint.
Yeah,
which is,
provocative title.
Great presentation. It's on YouTube. I'd encourage anyone to watch it. Peter J. Williams, Why I Don't Believe in the Septuagint.
Extremely provocative title, right? but it was kind of interesting because, Jeff Riddle kept using Pete's research from that talk, which is fine and good, but I felt like he was leveraging it in a way that Pete maybe wouldn't agree with. Like,
an interesting critique. So he doesn't say I misused Peter J. Williams, but he says, that's what Peter J. Williams says. Peter J. Williams basically agrees with my first point. There was no standard Septuagint at the time of the apostles. And he in fact says we ought to talk about, not use the word Septuagint, but we ought to use the term Greek translations of the Old Testament. But Meade doesn't like the way, as he puts it, I leverage it. And my question is, and he's going to go on to say that Peter J. Williams believes that the Hebrew text can be corrected by the Septuagint. What he seems to be frustrated by is I can use Williams' material, even though Williams doesn't agree with the confessional text position. And where is it a canon of modern academic study that if you quote someone, you must agree with everything else, every other position that they hold? So I can't quote any of the work of Peter J. Williams because I don't agree with his willingness to give latitude to using the Septuagint to correct the Hebrew Old Testament. I can't use any of his other work. I don't think that holds up by any academic standard. We quote people all the time in one area without agreeing with them in every other area of their research findings or writings.
Just because there's no Septuagint or no defined corpus of Greek translations, of course, doesn't mean those Greek translations didn't exist. Okay.
I never claimed that they didn't exist. I agree with Peter J. Williams. There were many Greek translations of the Old Testament, including ones that might have been made by the apostolic writers. So he's setting up here a straw man. You see what he did? He said, it doesn't mean they didn't exist. I never claimed they didn't exist. What I'm saying is there was no uniform standard Greek translation of the Old Testament at the time of the apostles. So we're going to be accused later on of making straw man arguments, but Dr. Meade just made a classic straw man argument. And notice, by the way, the laughing and the smiling. I think he's nervous because I think he realizes that he's stretching it here in a misrepresentation. He's nervous about it.
First of all. And then second of all, it doesn't mean that Dr. Pete Williams wouldn't ever use the Septuagint for text critical purposes. Like, does that make sense? So
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I just felt like
I never made any claims about what Peter J. Williams would do, whether or not he would use early Greek translation of the Old Testament to try to correct the Hebrew. I was simply using him to support the first point factually that there was no standard Septuagint at the time of the apostles. I made no claims, nor did I misrepresent Pete Williams' views on whether or not the Septuagint or early Greek translations might be used to correct the Hebrew.
like that part was really unclear.
I don't know what was unclear about it. I never made any claims about what Peter J. Williams' bibliology was beyond using what he said about there being no standard Septuagint at the time of the apostles.
And Will, if you have other examples, because he quoted yours and Greg's book quite a bit.
Pause here for a moment and let me just stop sharing this for just a second. And it might be helpful at this point for me just to bring up my PowerPoint, if I can. Yeah. So this is my PowerPoint. 4 challenges regarding the New Testament and the Septuagint that I used in my presentation. Let's see if we get this advancing. There we go. First challenge, there was no standard or uniform Septuagint, so-called Septuagint, at the time of the apostles. Now, he makes it sound as though that I spent a lot of time talking about Peter J. Williams. Actually, as you'll see in just a moment, Peter J. Williams is cited in one slide. And I didn't even start with him. I started with the book Invitation to the Septuagint by Karen Jobes and Moses Silva. And I started off with their statement, strictly speaking, there is really no such thing as the Septuagint. I noted A.C. Sundberg's article in the collection, respected collection of essays under the title The Canon Debate, where he says that the Greek translation of the Jewish scripture came to be called by the Latin term Septuaginta only not until Augustine's City of God in the 5th century. I did talk about Peter J. Williams, and I said, I noted his statement that rather than the term Septuagint, he suggests pre-Christian translations of the Old Testament into Greek, and that there was no standard Greek translation of the Old Testament known as the Septuagint in ancient times. I didn't stop there, though. I also made reference to Lanier and Ross's book, which basically says the same thing. Dr. Meade made reference to the fact that they problematized the whole idea of the term Septuagint. I didn't stop there. I also gave a quotation from Edmund Gallagher in his book, The Translation of the 70, where he says, the Septuagint is not a thing, it is an idea. And so please go watch my video, my presentation, my plenary presentation, and you evaluate whether you think Dr. Meade's critique of my presentation of Peter J. Williams' ideas are a misrepresentation of him. And I think if you do, and you listen to it fairly, you'll see that I did not unfairly represent Peter J. Williams, his views. I made no claims about his bibliology other than what he had to say about the Septuagint in the first century. Let's see. Let's return now.
Yeah.
And
right.
I'm not, I've read your book, of course. I've endorsed it. I think it's a wonderful book on the Septuagint. But I had some questions about whether he was even citing you all properly in some places. And then, of course, my good friend and co-author Ed Gallagher's book got used quite a bit. And I think some of Ed's ideas were also misunderstood or misquoted as well. So,
well, I want to take exception to that too. Now, this is interesting. If you listen to the rest of this presentation, we're only about 9 minutes, 37 seconds in. It goes to an hour and 29 minutes. He never again, the remainder of this time, says anything about Ed Gallagher's work. But he does at this point say that there were places where he thought I misused or misunderstood him, but he gives no examples. Give an example of it. I was very careful when I quoted Gallagher and everyone else I quoted. In fact, towards the end of my presentation, I gave a very long quotation from Gallagher, and I made sure to put it was like a full page, because I didn't want to be accused of taking what he said out of context. So I take exception to that criticism. I don't think it's accurate. I don't think it's a just criticism of my paper, my presentation, because I tried to be scrupulously fair in representing the views of the people that I cited. And I did not, certainly knowingly or intentionally, and I don't think I did, in fact, misrepresent anyone's ideas in my presentation.
So I wasn't inspired from the outset or encouraged, let's say, to say that there was really goodwill in play here. Like, I didn't know.
So wait a second here. So he's saying I had ill will in this presentation, and let's face it. When it comes down to it, the main reason he feels like that I didn't have goodwill is I didn't agree with him. These men are academic scholars. Surely they've been in contexts where people disagree with them. It'd be wrong to disagree with people uncharitably, unkindly, to misrepresent them. That would be wrong. But I didn't have a spirit of ill will. And yes, my position is different. I disagree with you. I think that your position, Dr. Meade, that of Dr. Ross and others, is a departure from the classic Protestant view. And so I don't have ill will toward you, but I think that your position is a departure from the classic view, and I'm trying to retrieve it. You don't agree with me. I'm not going to accuse you of ill will toward me for that reason alone. But anyways, let's go on.
How some of these sources were being used in the overall argument. I think too, he basically says in answer to that question, since there was no unified Septuagint basically until the 20th century with Alfred Ralphs, whose edition is around here somewhere, but anyhow, and that's not quite right either. I mean, you can go back at least as early as Justin Martyr, who's attributing the work of translation to the 70 translators of all of the books of the Old Testament. You're right.
Let's pause here for a moment. Justin Martyr, when was Justin Martyr writing? Justin Martyr was writing around the year 165. So he was writing probably about 100 years after the gospel writers. If we say the book of Revelation, perhaps the last book, maybe around the year 90, he's writing at least 75 years after that. And then if you look at what Justin Martyr says, what he's talking about is a section in his writings where he's defending the reading at Isaiah 7:14 of Parthenos, that Jesus was born of a virgin. He's defending that, and he says this was what was written in the 70. Well, I mean, that's striking because, as Peter J. Williams and others have said, it seems to be the consensus of modern scholarship is there was not an ancient document that was called the Septuagint. And again, A.C. Sundberg says the term Septuagint, it doesn't appear until the City of God, written by Augustine in the 5th century. But Justin Martyr says it was written by the 70s. He doesn't say there is a Septuagint. And one of the other points that was made in the discussion was that the idea of a standard Greek translation of the Old Testament, that's really a product of the Christian era. And what I said about the Rolf's edition of the Septuagint that was published in 1925 was that what does it do? It uses Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and Alexandrinus, which are Christian documents. I'm using Christian here loosely because we don't know the provenance of them, and I disagree with a lot of the readings in Vaticanus and Sinaiticus in particular. But they're from the third and fourth and perhaps fifth, they're from the 4th and 5th centuries of the Christian era. So it actually cinches the point that at the time of the apostles, there was no standard Greek Septuagint. And my point was, we tend to think today, many do, that there's a standard Septuagint because we now have a mass-produced printed edition, and not just in print, but we have digital editions of the Rolf's edition. And really, that's only been printed editions of the Septuagint. Yes, there were some early printed editions of the Septuagint, like in the Complutensian Polyglot. But there were, when, say, Codex Alexandrinus was published by Brian Walton in the 17th century, but a mass-produced available copy of the Septuagint is a relatively recent phenomenon, and I don't think anyone would really refute that. Anyways.
Right. So I just, again, just little sleights of hand, I felt like, on point one.
I really take exception to that. What was the sleight of hand? Was there, what information was misrepresented? Would you call it a sleight of hand that you're citing Justin Martyr for there being an early Septuagint when he was writing 100 years after the gospel writers? Is that a sleight of hand? What sleight of hand exactly did I perform?
But it gets worse. It gets worse in point two.
Well, you haven't proven that anything was bad, but for your rhetoric here, I guess it gets worse. Well, you haven't proven anything was bad, but let's hear what is supposedly now worse.
Because here he wants to say, basically, when a New Testament author offers a quotation based upon an existing work, including a Greek translation of the Old Testament, this does not mean that everything from the work from which the quote is taken should be considered wholly inspired, right? So he looks at the way Paul quotes various philosophers, right? Okay, fine, great. But then basically he, on this level, then we shouldn't take the translation seriously, like the translation of the Hebrew Bible seriously. And I just thought that was again, more sloppiness, right? Sleights of hand. Like you've got, okay, fine. Paul probably doesn't think the whole work of Menander is, canonical. Obviously not. But then to say, therefore, he would have the same view of a Greek translation of a Hebrew text. That's a stretch, right? That's not.
Okay, now he's accused me of sloppiness, and he's made a second accusation of sleight of hand. And you might have lost possibly his train of thought if you're not familiar with my lecture at this point. Let me just go back once again to my PowerPoint. If I can pull this up. We talked about the first point, and I did talk about the modern edition of the Septuagint, so-called Ralph's Handhart edition. I said 1925, it should be 1935. The second edition, or the corrected edition by Handhart in 2006. Then the second challenge, when a New Testament author offers a quotation based upon existing work, including a Greek translation of the Old Testament, this does not mean that everything from the work from which the quote is taken should be considered wholly inspired or authoritative for faith and practice. I did talk about the fact that there were uninspired works that are cited in the New Testament. So when Paul cites Epimenides in Titus 1:12, it doesn't mean all the writings of Epimenides are canonical. But the Spirit leads authors to quote sometimes from uninspired works, and the part that they quote becomes part of inspired scripture, but doesn't mean that all of it. And that does have implications for understanding quotations from Greek translations of the Old Testament by New Testament authors. And it's funny that he's offering this critique while Ross is sitting right beside him, because I offered a quotation from Ross and Lanier, which basically says the same thing. I used them in support of this point. They wrote on pages 182 to 183 of their book, clearly a New Testament author's use of a source, even one with an it is written formula, does not imbue it with inspired status or even imply that the author thought the source was inspired. Paul's use of the Greek poet Aratus and Jude's apparent use of First Enoch do not magically make those texts inspired or normative. That is, they do not become scripture in the same way in which they are quoted. Such inspired use of non-inspired sources simply conveys that the information being used is true and thus pertinent to the argument being made. And notice this last sentence. This is Ross and Lanier. This distinction should also apply at least as an initial starting point to quotations from the Greek Old Testament. Let me ask you this, Dr. Meade. Were Dr. Ross and Dr. Lanier using sloppiness and sleight of hand when they made the same affirmation that I'm making, and when I cite them verbatim from their writings to prove my point? Now you need to pay attention to this, because we're going to come back to this later. Ross is going to claim that I basically stole this idea from him. I also quoted Francis Turretin. Turretin said this, a couple centuries before Ross and Lanier ever came on the scene. He said in his Elliptic Theology, the quotations in the New Testament from the Septuagint are not authentic per se, but per accidens, inasmuch as they were drawn into the sacred context by the evangelists under the influence of the Holy Spirit. Was Francis Turretin being sloppy? Was he using sleight of hand when he made this argument? And so, again, I can't take Dr. Meade's critique seriously, because he's misrepresenting my argument and really, in the end, appealing to ad hominem and straw man attacks upon it. Let's go back to the lecture if we can. Okay, and we'll pick it back up.
Not quite, that's not following. The point B is not quite following from point A there. His third point, the quotations of the OT found in the New Testament do not uniformly follow the text of the so-called Septuagint. Therefore, we don't need to follow the Septuagint either. And here, Jeff Riddle is as selective as can be. he finds.
So now we move on to the third point. My third point was that when you actually look at the New Testament quotations of the Old Testament, you often find that the New Testament writers are not quoting from what people today think of as the Septuagint. And he makes a charge against me that I am only selective in my use of sources. Now, again, I only had 45 minutes to make this presentation, and I could not be exhaustive. There will be more examples in the written format. But let's listen first of all, and we're going to go back and we'll look at my PowerPoint, my lecture, and you'll be able to evaluate whether Dr. Meade is fairly evaluating the examples that I put forward. Was I being just selective, or was I trying to give a fuller view of in defense of my position?
He basically looks at 3 texts. He had 2 more he could have looked at. They're all from Matthew. They're all from the fulfillment formulae. Matthew 1, 22, 23, right? It's quotation of Isaiah 7:14 he looked at. He looked at the quotation of Hosea 11:1 and Matthew 2:15. And then he looked at, he will be called a Nazarene, right, in Matthew 2:23 with its possible reliance on Isaiah 11, verse 1. All great examples of a New Testament author using a form of the text that is much closer to the Hebrew, right, than the Greek Septuagint. So no.
I'm glad he's willing to concede that the examples that I offered in my lecture were great examples. And see, the point was that, again, I had 45 minutes, and I'm wanting to demonstrate that the New Testament authors do not quote from a standard Septuagint, and they often give quotations that indicate that they were well aware of the Hebrew, and maybe they were their own translations, or they were drawing from more literal translations from the Hebrew as opposed to the Septuagint. So he says that what I did was selective. So I'm going to go back. He says I only used 3 examples, and I want to see if I can pull up my presentation here. And I want to just listen to part of my presentation at this point.
Found in Matthew chapters 1 and 2. There are 5 famous passages.
So I did not give 3 examples from Matthew 1 and 2. I gave 5 examples.
Where Matthew describes the birth of our Lord, and he says these events happen to fulfill what the prophets had said. And some of these, obviously, maybe all of them you're well familiar with. Let's look at a couple of them, and I wish we had time to look at all of them closely. We're not going to have a chance to do that, so I'm going to pick and choose a couple.
I did give greater focus to several, but I did show all 5 of them and made brief comments on all 5 of them. And he claimed that I was selective. The very first example I gave, I clearly said, this example of the 5 is one where the quotation in Matthew 1:23 is closest to what we understand as the Septuagint today. So I pointed out that one of these 5 examples is actually one that does show some affinity to what we know today as the Septuagintal text, even though Meade accuses me of being wholly selective. Listen to what I said.
Let's start off with the one that seems most closely to resemble the type of Septuagint that we find in the Ralph's edition.
Okay, it was that selective. Well, let's go a little bit further. I'm going to push it a little bit further ahead. When I got finished with reviewing the 5 fulfillment citations in Matthew 1 and 2, I proceeded, again, I had a limited amount of time to work with. I proceeded, however, to give some reference to other quotations from the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I specifically said, I pointed out, hey, these examples I'm giving are from a limited space. They're here from the first 2 chapters of Matthew. What about Matthew as a whole? I gave a little bit of evidence for Matthew as a whole. Then I conceded, many people think Matthew is written for a Jewish audience. What about Paul, who's who's pursuing primarily the Gentile mission. How did he use the Old Testament? I did not cite specific examples, but I referred the readers to Edmund Gallagher, who points out that many of Paul's quotations seem to be from the so-called Septuagint, but not all of them. And in my paper, I will have even more examples, and I will make reference to Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, probably more than any other, seems to have readings that come from the Septuagint. But I was working with a limited amount of time. But even then, I was not wholly selective. But is it wrong for me to use examples that support my overall point? Is it wrong for me to use examples that illustrate that the biblical authors, the apostolic authors like Matthew, show that they have awareness of the Hebrew Bible? And can't I point to those examples as evidence to over against some simplistic and erroneous view that the New Testament authors are somehow exclusively only using the so-called Septuagint? But let me just play this part, and you evaluate whether you think Dr. Meade's assessments of my presentation were fair.
Septuagint. Having examined these 5 fulfillment citations from Matthew's birth narrative, we see that Matthew seems to draw upon a variety of sources for his Old Testament citations. These include Greek translations like the Septuagint, Isaiah 7:14, but they also include perhaps his own translations or paraphrases taken from the Hebrew Masoretic text. What it shows us is that certainly there is no uniform Greek translation of the Old Testament from which Matthew consistently draws. And this has been studied, obviously, by other people. They've looked at this. Robert Gundry did a monograph some decades back in which he studied all the Old Testament citations that are found in Matthew. And as he looked through those, he says he found approximately 80 formal and elusive quotations of the Old Testament in the Gospels. Of these, he said, only about 30 follow the readings in the so-called Septuagint. So you see the point. We can't say the Septuagint is the Bible of the early church when the apostolic authors were not uniformly citing it or referring to it. Now you might say, well, wait a second, Riddle. Matthew was written for a Jewish audience. What about apostolic authors who are writing for Gentile audiences? Might they have been more prone to use the Septuagint? And I would recommend, again, the recent book by Gallagher. He does a nice survey of how the New Testament authors cite the Old Testament. And with relationship to Paul, for example, he says in Paul's writings, we find that he mostly used the Septuagint, but not always. And there are a number of passages in Paul where the argument can be made that he's drawing upon the Hebrew Masoretic text and not the Septuagint.
So, do you think that Dr. Meade's assessment of my presentation, that I gave no attention to any countermanding evidence? I did, in fact. Is he accusing me of marshaling evidence in support of my position? Of what else was I going to do? Of course, I was going to, in a limited amount of time, I was going to marshal primarily the evidence that supports my position. He also disregards the fact that later on in this lecture, I talked about Acts 15, verses 15 through 17, and its quotation from Amos 9, verses 11 and 12. Also later in the presentation, I talked about Hebrews 10, verses 5 through 7, and its quotation of Psalm 39, verses 7 through 9 in the Septuagint, versified as chapter 40, verses 6 through 8, Psalm 40, verses 6 through 8, rather, in the standard Protestant chapter and verse presentations. So I did talk about other passages. And therefore, I do not think that Dr. Meade's critique here of my presentation is just.
Argument there, but the argument or the dispute that I would have is why didn't Jeff give any of the examples that don't support his case?
Did you listen to what I said about Isaiah 7:14? are you being sloppy? Are you misrepresenting what I actually said?
Like at
Right.
all.
I kept thinking that over and over again. Yeah.
Interesting.
Why weren't more passages mentioned? I mean, the passages in which it sure seems like they're quoting whatever you want to call it, the Septuagint.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought that was really questionable, of course. Will, I don't know what you thought, because you do all this comparative method stuff like I do. He would, on those examples, he would share the authorized version next to the authorized version of the New Testament, and then he would share the Textus Receptus Greek text of the New Testament, and then the Rolfe Septuagint text next to the authorized version of the Old Testament English translation. But
I don't know why that he thinks that's so strange. And I explained in the presentation, we had the New Testament text in English for people who are there who maybe don't read the Greek text. So there's the New Testament text in English, the authorized version. There's the Greek text from the Textus Receptus. Then there's the Septuagintal text so that you can compare the Greek in the New Testament with the passage that is cited in the Septuagint. Then I explained in the last column, there was the Old Testament in English because most people there are not able to read Hebrew on the fly. And I put it from the authorized version, which generally closely follows the Masoretic text in its translation. And thereby one can see a contrast between the Masoretic text through an English translation that follows the Masoretic text, the AV, and the Septuagint, and the passage as it's cited in the Greek New Testament. In one of the examples, I did put the Hebrew up there, the very last one, that has the question about he will be a Nazarene. So why do they think this is inconsistent or funny? Again, a lot of nervous laughter. One of the things you also see in this review as it goes on is they sort of play off each other, and they sort of have a tendency to try to make things sound worse and worse the more they go on, and you get Meade laughing and smiling. And again, I think it's a lot of it, I think, is showing deep down his lack of certainty, nervousness about what he's saying.
it's apples and oranges, to put it.
Apples and oranges is comparing the Greek text of the New Testament with the Greek text of the Septuagint, and looking at English translation of the Old Testament that fairly reflects the Hebrew Masoretic text. So it's making proper comparisons in a limited space in a PowerPoint.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. It's a bunch of irrelevant data. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've got plenty to say about this paper. I thought it.
So Ross is going to start talking about my paper. He's going to switch and talk a little bit briefly about some of the seminar papers before he comes back to me. So there's a line here to not know whether he's talking about me or the seminar papers, but I'm not sure. I don't think he's very fair in either count. But anyways, let's listen.
It was flawed in a lot of ways, and I think it was characteristic of many of the papers that I heard. I didn't hear all of them, especially with the breakout sessions, which were happening simultaneously, but a lot of shoddy use of scholarship, a lot of
thus far, you haven't shown me any shoddy use of scholarship. And I think, unfortunately, Dr. Ross, although he started off rightly talking about how he was well received, he sort of begins to jump on this bandwagon of how there was all this so-called shoddy scholarship. To me, it's shoddy scholarship when you say that this Reformation Bible Society was a group of King James Version defenders who were turning on the Septuagint. That seems like something that is shoddy use of scholarship. But anyways, let's go on.
Even basic things like mispronounced words that would be common to people who work in more detail with Septuagint scholarship.
This is interesting too. This is one of those sort of places where he says there were a lot of mispronounced words and so forth. And he says there's a way that we who are specialists in the Septuagint, we have a particular way of pronouncing these various things. He gives us no examples. This is an excellent opportunity for you to teach. If please correct us, tell us the way we should pronounce these terms. And is there a uniform way to pronounce these terms? One of the other ironic things is later on they're going to talk about Peter Van Cleek Jr.'s presentation on Augustine of Hippo, and Dr. Ross will pronounce his name as Augustine. Well, I was taught in graduate school that the great North African theologian was called Augustine of Hippo, and we don't pronounce his name Augustine. We pronounce it Augustine. Does that mean that Dr. Ross's views and his critique are inadequate because he uses a different pronunciation than the standard pronunciation I was taught? He gives us no examples of this, but it's just sort of a condescending type of critique that he never gives us an example of.
Yeah, but for Jeff Riddle's paper, the whole thing is structured around this desire he has to prove that it is wrong to use the Septuagint to amend the Masoretic text.
Right. Can I pause you real?
I want to pause there. He says, all my paper was centered around this thing where it's wrong to use the Septuagint to correct the Masoretic text. And my answer to that is guilty. Yes, that was the whole point of the entire conference. It was the point of every paper. It was the presupposition of my paper that we should not use the Septuagint to correct the traditional Hebrew text of the Old Testament. That was the basis for all the standard Protestant translations of the Bible. This was the position. This is the classic Protestant position. And it's interesting that this position is being put forward by these men as almost something that's heretical. How bizarre and strange that Riddle is wanting to suggest that the Septuagint should not be used to correct the Masoretic text. But yeah, that's the whole point.
Quick, Will, and just let's get real clarity on that. I wanted to ask, what's the upshot of the whole conference? And I think you just named it. Would you say that's accurate? That's what everybody was supposed to be pointing at. I think some of the presenters didn't quite get the memo, but
another kind of Mark Ward thing. He wants to present this idea that all four of the plenary speakers were not in agreement with this. Well, Mr. Ward, I'm afraid you're wrong. Dr. Cranendonk holds to the confessional text view. He's from a Dutch Reformed tradition. He preaches from the King James Version. You might accuse him of being in sin for that. But he upholds the traditional text view. Dr. Fuller agrees with us with respect to the Old Testament. He defends the Masoretic text. He's a credentialed scholar with a PhD from Hebrew Union College, a Jewish graduate school, and he has expert knowledge in the Masoretic text, and he believes that it should be the standard and not corrected by the Septuagint. There was not disagreement among the four presenters, and Dr. Meade looks so funny here laughing at this. Our position, there was not division among the four presenters. You might want there to have been, but there wasn't.
Jeff did, Christian did. I wonder if Russell Fuller quite did, and David Cronendonk did. But that's what Riddle was going for.
The whole upshot is we must not amend the Masoretic text, because the Masoretic text is the confessional text, by which they mean it is the text in view in Westminster Confession of Faith 1:8.
Right.
That the divines had in mind, even though they didn't say it, but they had it in mind.
They did say it, though.
That it is perfect, kept pure in all ages, and therefore we need no ancient versions or anything else to amend the text. And so this was a conference.
Yes, we are, this is where the rubber is meeting the road. Yes, we are defending the traditional Protestant view. Now, he seems to be suggesting that that's not the traditional Protestant view. He seems to be saying that the modern view that suggests you can use ancient translations to correct a corrupted Hebrew text, that was the view of the Protestants, but that's not the case. Let me just cite a few things. Go back and read the translator to the reader section titled "The Translation of the Old Testament out of the Hebrew into Greek" in the Authorized Version, 1611. Again, I'm not appealing to it merely because it's the Authorized Version, but it gives you an insight into the way the divines of that age thought about the Septuagint. And what they say there, if you read it, is that the Septuagint, that the 70 were interpreters, not prophets. And it notes they were learned men, but if you read it, it says they stumbled and fell, one while through oversight, another through ignorance. Yea, sometimes they be noted to add to the original, and sometimes to take from it, which made the apostles to leave them many times when they left the Hebrew, and to deliver the sense thereof, according to the truth of the word, as the Spirit gave them utterance. Clearly, the Hebrew was the standard for those English Protestant divines. Yes, look at the Westminster Confession of Faith of 1646, the Old Testament in Hebrew, not the Old Testament in Hebrew and corrected by Septuagint or the Latin Vulgate, particularly in their apologetic engagements with Rome, which was saying, we need Mother Church to rightly interpret the Bible, and it's the Latin Vulgate, an ancient translation, that is the standard for the Old Testament. No, it's the Old Testament in Hebrew, which was the native language of the people of God of old, and the New Testament in Greek, which at the time of the writing of it was most generally known to the nations. The New Testament in Greek, not the Septuagint. And it says of the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament, being immediately inspired by God and by his singular care and providence, kept pure in all ages. Does that sound like they believe that the Hebrew text had been corrupted, that the Greek text had been corrupted, and now the scholars must get together and reconstruct it? No. Think about what John Owen said. John Owen, writing in the year 1659, little essay on scripture that's in volume 16 of his collected works, he said this: to advance all translations concurring into an equality with the originals, so to set them by it as to set them up with it on even terms, much more to propose and use them as a means of castigating, amending, altering anything in them, gathering various lections by them, is to set up an altar of our own by the altar of God, and to make equal the wisdom, care, skill, and diligence of men with the wisdom, care, and providence of God himself. End of quote. That's from Owen's Works, volume 16, page 357. He says, if you set up an ancient translation over against the original, and you attempt to use that translation to correct the original, then you have set up an idol against the altar of God. And he says, particularly if you try to use that to amend the text, you are depending upon, notice what he said, the wisdom, care, skill, and diligence of men, rather than the wisdom, care, and providence of God. You see, the contrast couldn't be clearer. Are we going to rely on the diligence of men to reconstruct the text, or are we going to rely on the works of God in providence through history to affirm the word? Think about Francis Turretin in his Elliptic Theology, 1696. He said, the question is whether it has such an authority as that it ought to be regarded as authentic. He's talking about the Septuagint. He has a whole section on the Septuagint. The question is whether it has such an authority that it ought to be regarded as authentic and equal to the sources. Our adversaries, the Roman Catholics, maintain this. We deny it. He continues. This is from volume 1 of his Eclectic Theology, page 128 of the Septuagint. It is not considered pure now, but greatly corrupted and interpolated. Here's how the great historian of the Reformation, post-Reformation era, Richard Muller, summarized the classic Protestant position in the second edition, corrected edition of his post-Reformation Reformed Dogmatics in 2003, volume 2, page 434. He said, "The Orthodox were highly critical of any attempt to exalt ancient versions to a level of authority over the Hebrew and Greek originals, even in matters of interpretation of individual verses. This does not mean, however, that they refuse to use the versions in exegesis and interpretation. What was ruled out categorically in the establishment of the text was gladly included in the work of interpretation." In other words, they categorically rejected any idea of using the ancient versions, including the Septuagint, to establish the text. But they were happy to use these ancient translations to give light on interpretation, not for reconstructing or establishing the text, but for interpretation. That is the classic Protestant position. And Dr. Ross, egged on by Mark Ward, is making it sound as though that this is some foreign, alien, strange thing, that the view of the Orthodox, Protestant Orthodox, is heretical, and that our attempt to retrieve it is somehow heretical. And it's actually their view that is the one that lines up with the view that was being rejected by the Protestant men of old.
It's focused on the Septuagint and its interest, but total irrelevance for textual criticism. That's the purpose.
Right. There would be moments when they would say it's interesting, but I just felt like they never got around to saying what was interesting. There was one presenter one time, I think, who said there might be some value for translation, but basically the gist was, we don't really need this.
Dr. Fuller gave several very specific examples of how the Septuagint might be useful for understanding vocabulary, etc. But yes, he was saying that it might be helpful in that way, but the authoritative text is the Masoretic Hebrew text.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah, there's a couple of sort of adjunct or peripheral points of interest, but nothing vital, I would say. Yeah. So go ahead. You look like you're about to say something.
I was only going to let you continue. Basically, Dr. Riddle interacted with you and mentioned you. Actually, several presenters did.
Sure.
And I thought I'd get you to go ahead and respond also to Dr. Riddle's argument, because his really was the central argument of the conference.
That's right. Yeah, and it was a little funny because no one knew I was there at first. So, in Dr. Riddle's initial paper, I had already said hello to him initially, but no one else had realized that I was there. So it was a little awkward at first. And at points, even in Jeff Riddle's paper, I was, I would say, mildly demonized, and I'll explain that.
Here he makes an accusation that he was mildly demonized. I would say basically that I did express disagreement with his conclusion in his book that the Septuagint could be used to correct the Hebrew text. I tried to do that charitably. I tried to do it forthrightly. I did it without throwing any ad hominems out. I did it without accusing him of sloppiness. I did it without accusing him of exercising sleight of hand. I just said, here's his position. I tried to fairly represent it, and here's why I think it's incorrect. And I don't think that's mildly demonizing him. I think that's expressing forthright disagreement. What Paul would say, speaking the truth, is speaking the truth in love.
But the premise of the paper was people argue in favor of amending the Masoretic text using the Septuagint, and they are wrong. They make that argument, Riddle says, because they believe the Septuagint was the Bible of the early church. Okay, and so if you watch his lecture, right around minute 12, he provides this syllogism of people he's arguing against. Premise 1, the Septuagint was the Bible of the earliest church, and we know this because the New Testament authors quoted it. Premise 2, the Septuagint has unique authority that justifies using it as a standard for evaluating the originality of the Old Testament text. And therefore, the conclusion, the Septuagint, as the Bible of the earliest church, can be used to, because that's the argument he's trying to counter. Okay.
Right.
The problem is no one's making that argument. Okay. No one's making that argument. I don't hold the premise 1. I don't hold the premise 2. The only people I'm aware of that would make an argument similar to that would be Mogens Mueller in his book, First Bible of the Church. Aside from Mueller, the only other person I can think of is Louis Capel, 17th century Reformed scholar, his work, Critica Sacra. He makes that very argument, and two of Dr. Riddle's favorite sources to cite in support of his own view, Turretin, Owen, they both criticize Capel very stridently.
They're not just criticizing Capel, they're criticizing Roman Catholicism. But anyways, I think this was a really striking statement for him to make. Basically saying my argument, my thesis in my paper is wrong, and really the thesis of the entire Reformation Bible Society is wrong, because no one today is making the argument that we ought to use the Septuagint to correct the Hebrew Old Testament text. He makes reference to my presentation. Let me pull up one more time the PowerPoint, and let's see, we'll go backward, I think, a little bit. We can get this to move. Yeah, let's see if we can do it here. This was what I presented as something like a syllogism, the argument to use the Septuagint to correct the Masoretic text. First premise, the Septuagint was the Bible of the earliest church, as shown by the fact that New Testament authors, apostles, and apostolic associates quoted from it. Second premise, the Septuagint possesses a unique authority that justifies its usage as a standard for evaluating the originality and accuracy of the text of the Old Testament. I'm basically saying there are people who want to use the Septuagint to correct the Old Testament, the Masoretic text, because the Septuagint was used by the New Testament authors and it has a unique authority, and therefore we can correct the traditional Old Testament Hebrew text by this ancient version. And here's the thing that I'm really astounded by, that namely that Dr. Ross says no one is making that argument today. Riddle is tilting at windmills. He is fighting a paper tiger. No one is making this argument today. And here is my response to that. So, Dr. Ross, no one is making this argument today. There's nothing to worry about. No one is saying we ought to correct the Old Testament by the Septuagint. Well, if that is true, if that's true, then we don't have any modern translations today that are attempting to change the base Hebrew text of the Old Testament by using the Septuagint or the Latin Vulgate or the Syriac or the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Samaritan Pentateuch. So the examples that I gave in the beginning of my presentation, mentioning, for example, additions that are made in Psalm 145 of an extra verse based on its appearance in the Septuagint, then it's actually not really happening. So there's no problem. This is just a fantasy creation of mine. What about historically at the Reformation, as I already mentioned, when the Council of Trent was saying that the Latin Vulgate was the standard that should correct the Hebrew text? What about today in Eastern Orthodoxy, when they say the standard for the Old Testament should not be the traditional Hebrew text, but it should be the Septuagint? What about, he said, there, no one is saying, maybe, Mueller, and not Richard Miller, but what about him? Well, what about this book by Timothy Michael Law, titled When God Spoke Greek, subtitled The Septuagint and the Making of the Christian Bible? I've also reviewed this book. It's in a review that was in Puritan Reformed Journal. And what does Timothy Michael Law say? He suggests in this book that the Septuagint should be used as the standard for the Old Testament, not the Hebrew text. He said we should side with Augustine and not with Jerome, and that the Greek translation of the Old Testament should be the standard. Is he at least one person? You said there's nobody, absolutely nobody making this argument. Again, all the modern translations that are currently significantly altering various verses in the Old Testament based on readings in the Septuagint, is that just not happening right now? What about on a popular level? Are you familiar with works like this by S. Douglas Woodward? Self-published internet people. Have you watched the YouTube channel of Stephen Hackett, where they're promoting we need to use the Septuagint as a standard for understanding the Old Testament? By the way, this book, its title is The Septuagint and the Defense of the Christian Bible, how the ancient Greek Septuagint emends the biblical text and best presents the case that Jesus was the Christ. And if you read this, he says that the rabbis altered the Hebrew text to take out prophecies of Christ. And so it's actually the Greek translation that's authoritative, not the Hebrew. And so this is exactly the opposite of what's stated in Westminster Confession of Faith 1:8, that the Bible was given in Hebrew for the Old Testament, Greek for the New Testament, and those words were immediately inspired, and by God's singular care and providence, they were kept pure in all ages. Are you really telling us that no one is making this argument, and so there's no need for us to have any worry or concern about this? When I heard him say that, it brought to my mind a few years ago, I was doing a series of podcasts where I was talking about the fact that the goal of modern New Testament textual criticism for 21st century textual criticism has shifted. And now they no longer talk about trying to recover the autograph, but instead they talk about the Ausgangs text, the initial text. And modern scholars say there's no way, it's a fruitless endeavor. It's even inappropriate. We shouldn't talk about one text of the New Testament. We should talk about many texts of the New Testament. And Peter Gurry, I was talking with him, and he's like, no, you're wrong, Jeff. There's not a bunch of postmodernism in New Testament textual criticism. No. It's not a major shift. It's only a minor shift. And he said, well, David C. Parker, he's not that influential, and his views aren't that influential. And a few months after we had that encounter, I noticed that he had a fellow named Paul Abidon Shah do a guest lecture in his classroom on Shah's book, which was a version of his doctoral dissertation. And the title of it was Changing the Goalpost of New Testament Textual Criticism. And his book, his thesis outlines exactly what I had been saying. And it outlines exactly what Peter Gurry told me actually wasn't really happening. And so I felt sort of the same here with Ross. Are you really going to dismiss my presentation and the theme for the Reformation Bible Society meeting because really there's nothing to worry about? No one's trying to use the Septuagint to correct the traditional Hebrew text. I really don't understand how one could possibly credibly say that in response to my presentation or in light of the evidence that is out there. Well, let's go just a little bit further and let Dr. Ross complete his points on my presentation.
And rightly so. But he presents this argument as if it represents the argument of people in general. But I don't know anyone who would make such an argument. And his 4 challenges, which John was enumerating, are meant to address those premises, right? So when he says, well, there was no standard Septuagint, that counters premise 1. When he says New Testament quotations of the Septuagint don't mean the whole thing was inspired, that counters premise 2, right? The problem is, I would agree that I don't hold the premise 1 and 2, and actually 2 of his counter arguments are my arguments.
So he says, I don't hold to this, but what did he react so unfavorably to about my review of his book? He reacted unfavorably because in my review, I pointed out that he and his co-author Lanier were saying that the Septuagint might and other evidence might be used to correct a corrupted Hebrew Old Testament. So yes, he does hold this view, and as do many other people in the modern academy. Now, the other interesting thing here is he claims here that I used his arguments to counter this, that I fallaciously used his arguments to counter this. And I take special exception to this too. I know I can see they're sort of jumping on the bandwagon. There's Dr. Meade with a big smile on his face. But let's listen to what else he says.
From the book that I wrote, in which he cited. And so there do seem to have been some oversights in terms of attribution there.
Oh, I really take exception to that, honestly. There were no oversights with respect to attribution. You know, one thing that's especially discouraging about this, to hear him say, the disappointing, is after I did my talk, Dr. Ross came up to me, and he can verify this himself, and he said to me, thank you for using the material in my book fairly. He said that to me, but I think in this conversation, you can kind of see how they're jumping on the bandwagon and laughing and getting sort of caught up in the moment. But I did not misuse his position. He also is going to claim that again, without attribution, that I'm basically just using his arguments. I've already shown you when I showed you the PowerPoint that with respect to the Septuagint not being any type of unified document in the first century, I wasn't depending upon Ross and Lanier. I quoted Jobes and Silva. I quoted Peter J. Williams. With respect to quotations of uninspired works in the New Testament needing to be understood as only authoritative to the degree they were incorporated by the authors, I quoted Ross and Lanier, but I also quoted Francis Turretin, who said that centuries before they said it. That's not their idea. Actually, I find it kind of disturbing that he seems to be claiming ideas are his own that were ones that were clearly stated by people before him. Yes, I used him as a contemporary example of someone articulating some of these views, but in no case were any of my counter arguments based on Ross and Lanier's analysis alone.
But to be fair, he put our book up on the screen. He put quotations from the book up on the screen, and he agrees with almost everything in the book, except our conclusion that,
which is that you use the Septuagint to correct the Hebrew Old Testament. Yes, I disagree with that part.
the Septuagint, along with any and all other ancient evidence, may help us correct the Masoretic text in certain circumstances, right? And insert lengthy and detailed text critical methodology, but that's the premise, right? So I think his argument is a bit of a red herring, right? He frames the paper with this anonymous position held by zero evangelical or conservative or confessional scholars known to me.
No one holds this position. No one is attempting to correct the Hebrew Old Testament using the Septuagint, right? It's interesting that he calls my position a red herring, my argument a red herring. Again, it's another accusation that addresses a lack of intellectual virtue. What is a red herring? A red herring is an argument that is only meant to mislead and distract. I almost got the feeling that Ross had sat down and read through a book on logical fallacies and just threw out all the ones he could remember in this talk. It's a straw man argument. It's a red herring. My arguments were not misleading. They were not meant to distract. They were not straw men, and so I take exception with this critique. I don't agree with it.
And then he uses the actual positions of evangelical conservative confessional scholars like me to argue against it. So
your position is not in defense of the classic Protestant view. So I was not using your arguments against what I think is a departure from the classic Protestant position.
I appreciate the commendation that Dr. Riddle gave certain parts of my book with Greg Lanier, but I found it misrepresentative. And it was a textbook straw man argument for the majority of the paper. And at no point does
textbook straw man argument and a red herring. Are those accurate? Are those just criticisms of my presentation? Please go listen to my presentation for yourself. When the written version of it comes out, which will be filled with more information and more footnotes, feel free to read it for yourself and see if I'm misrepresenting, and that no one makes this argument today, and we're just Don Quixote tilting at a windmill.
Does this counter argument succeed in showing the MT should not be amended, right? It's a counter argument to an argument no one makes.
Right. Yeah, I found it kind of redolent of my own interactions with him, which I did frankly find frustrating and ultimately led me to choose to stop interacting. But here I am back at it again because...
Yeah, here you are back at it again because actually you never really stopped, did you? Let's be honest about it. Wow, this has been a long episode. I hadn't done an episode in a long time. We only made it through, about 20 minutes of an hour and a half review. But I think I'm going to have to bring this issue to a close. Let me just hit a couple of quick points. I don't think, I'm glad that the review is out there to draw attention to the Reformation Bible Society. I don't think that this review fairly represented what the Reformation Bible Society is about. Let me just say, though, we will have the Reformation Bible Society in 2025, August the 2nd, and we'll be announcing the venue for that soon. And it's going to be on the book of Revelation. And so come on out and plan to be with us for that meeting. I will also just add, as we draw to a close, it's funny, I was thinking about this response, and I was thinking about, some of the charges that were made against the Reformation Bible Society, against me, against my presentation, and also how I would rightly respond to this. And it just so happened that this year in 2024, in our Lord's Day afternoon services in our church, we're going through the Heidelberg Catechism. And we don't do this every year, but we're doing it this year. And you probably well know that the Heidelberg Catechism is divided into 52 Lord's Days. And so every Sunday, there's a set of question and answers that you work through. And it just so happens you get towards the end of the year. Of course, the Heidelberg Catechism is divided into three parts. It talks about man's guilt. It talks about grace in Christ. And then the last part is on gratitude, living a life of gratitude in response to the grace of God in Christ. And at the end of the year, you go through the 10 Commandments and then the Lord's Prayer. And last Sunday, October the 27th, was Lord's Day 43. And the topic was the 9th commandment from Exodus 20:16, thou shalt not bear false witness. And there's just one question and answer. Question 112, what is required in the 9th commandment? And listen to the answer. I preached on this Sunday. That I bear false witness against no man, nor falsify any man's words, that I be no backbiter nor slanderer, that I do not judge nor join in condemning any man rashly or unheard, but that I avoid all sorts of lies and deceit as the proper works of the devil, unless I would bring down upon me the heavy wrath of God. Likewise, that in judgment and all other dealings I love the truth, speak it uprightly, and confess it. Also, that I defend and promote as much as I am able the honor and good character of my neighbor. And I just thought it was appropriate to preach on, fitting to preach on that on Sunday, and still have the lingering thoughts of it as I entered into doing this podcast today. We would hope we could disagree charitably, that we could do that while trying as much as we are able to uphold the honor and good character of our neighbor. Well, with that, I'm going to bring this episode of Word Magazine to a conclusion. I hope this has been profitable, edifying for those who are listening. And I will look forward to speaking to you in the next episode of Word Magazine. Till then, take care, and may the Lord richly bless you.